What if I told you that Canada hides mountain ranges so remote that some have never seen a permanent human settlement? Ranges where glaciers stretch for hundreds of miles, where polar bears roam beneath ancient peaks, where billion-year-old mountains still stand exposed to the sky, holding secrets that scientists are only beginning to understand. You already know the Rockies, Banff, Jasper, Lake Louise, but those famous mountains are only a small part of Canada's story. Beyond them lies a hidden world of forgotten ranges, isolated valleys, and landscapes so wild that few people even know they exist. Today, we're exploring 7 mountain ranges hidden across Canada. Some are older than complex life itself. Some remain among the most remote places in North America, and the range at number 1 may be the most extraordinary landscape in the entire country. Let's find them. Canada is the second largest country on Earth. Within its vast wilderness lie mountain ranges that rarely appear in travel guides, postcards, or even geography textbooks. No crowds, no resorts, just stone, ice, and silence. Here are 7 mountain ranges most people never knew existed. Number 7. The Monashee Mountains, southeastern British Columbia. Most people driving through the interior of British Columbia don't realize they are crossing one of the most snow-drenched mountain ranges on the continent. The Monashees rise from the valleys of the Okanagan and Columbia rivers in a wall of peaks running roughly 400 kilometers north to south, the westernmost chain of a broader system known as the Columbia Mountains. They are not small, they are not obscure on a geological map, and yet they almost never appear in conversation because the Canadian Rockies, visible just to the east across the Columbia Valley on clear days, consume every last available headline. The Monashees remain invisible in their shadow. But the real story of these mountains isn't about the peaks, it's about what falls from the sky above them. Atmospheric rivers, those massive columns of Pacific moisture that meteorologists now track like weather systems of their own, roll in from the ocean and slam directly into the Monashees before they've had a chance to lose their load. The result is snowfall that defies easy description. Some valleys in the Monashee system receive upwards of 15 meters of snow in a single winter. To put that in perspective, that's nearly 50 feet, enough to bury a 4-story building to its rooftop. Some of the deepest snowpack readings ever recorded in North America have come from stations buried within this range. That snowfall builds something extraordinary on the lower slopes. Ancient forests of western red cedar and hemlock so dense they block the sky, fed by snowmelt streams that run crystalline through valleys where no logging road has ever ventured. Wolverines move through the timber like ghosts. Woodland caribou follow migration corridors that predate every human map. Mountain goats stand on ledges of rock so steep they look painted onto the cliff face. But that isn't even the most surprising part. The name itself carries an origin story that most people would never guess. Monashee is believed to derive from the Gaelic phrase Monad Sith, Mountain of Peace, or Mountain of the Fairies, almost certainly brought to the interior of British Columbia by Scottish and Irish fur traders working for the Hudson's Bay Company during the early 19th century. Imagine it, Gaelic-speaking men from the Highland Glens, standing in the middle of the continent, looking up at a wall of snow-covered peaks and reaching back across the Atlantic for a name. The Monashees are largely trailless. They are not dramatic in the sharp-edged Rockies way. They are quiet, heavy with snow, and relentlessly wild, a mountain range hiding inside a mountain province. Number 6. The Caribou Mountains, central eastern British Columbia. Move north from the Monashees, deeper into the interior plateau of British Columbia, and you enter territory that once drove an entire continent mad with gold fever. The Caribou Mountains form the northern arm of the same Columbia Mountain system, a chain of heavily glaciated peaks rising above the central BC plateau, their highest summits approaching 3,500 meters, their lower flanks draped in spruce and fir. Glaciers still cling to north-facing cirques. Rivers born in these mountains still run cold and clear, and those rivers once carried enough gold in their gravel bars to trigger one of the largest mass migrations in North American history. In 1858, word reached San Francisco that gold had been found along the Fraser River, draining south out of the BC interior. Within months, tens of thousands of prospectors, Americans, Europeans, Chinese laborers, men and women from a dozen countries were pouring northward into what was not yet a province. The rush moved inland, pushed deeper into the wilderness, and eventually reached the creek beds draining the western flanks of the Caribou Mountains. Barkerville, a town born from nothing in the forest, briefly became the largest settlement west of Chicago and north of San Francisco. The gold rush faded, the mountains swallowed the evidence. What remains today is remarkable in a quieter way. Wells Gray Provincial Park, one of BC's largest and most spectacular protected areas, sits at the western edge of the Caribous. Its Helmicken Falls, dropping 141 meters into a volcanic canyon, is taller than Niagara. Its volcanic lakes glow in shades of turquoise that don't seem real, yet even Wells Gray, with all of that, attracts only a fraction of the visitors that queue for Banff on a summer weekend. The mountains above it, the Trophy Range, the glaciated heart of the Caribou proper, are almost entirely unknown, yet what exists beyond those ridgelines would stop most people cold. Wildflower meadows that bloom in full color for exactly 6 weeks each summer, then vanish under early snow. River systems clean enough to drink from in the Alpine. And grizzly bears, dozens of them, moving through valleys where they have never once had reason to fear a human being. Number 5. The Selwyn Mountains Yukon/Northwest Territories border here is where the wilderness changes its quality. The Selwyn Mountains run along the boundary between the Yukon and the Northwest Territories, rising from the Mackenzie Lowlands in the east and the Yukon Plateau in the west, in a series of ridges that push past 2,700 meters at their highest points. They were named in the late 19th century after Alfred Selwyn, director of the Geological Survey of Canada, a man who spent his career cataloging rock that very few human eyes would ever actually see. That tradition has continued. The Selwyns are among the most remote mountain ranges in Canada. There are virtually no roads, no permanent settlements, no maintained trails for visitors. Access, if you can call it that, means float planes, extended river travel, and wilderness expeditions that require the kind of logistical planning more common to polar exploration. Most Canadians have never heard the name, most who have couldn't point to them on a map. And yet the Selwyns sit at the headwaters of some of the most dramatic river systems on the continent. The South Nahanni River, a waterway we will hear more about very shortly, rises in this landscape, draining eastward toward the Mackenzie in a series of canyons and gorges that geographers have run out of superlatives to describe. The Selwyns are a study in a particular kind of grandeur, not the photogenic grandeur of famous peaks, not the theatrical grandeur of famous waterfalls, but the grandeur of pure absolute removal from anything human, a landscape where you understand viscerally that you are genuinely far from help. Most people never realize what exists beyond the next ridge here. Not just wilderness, but a version of it that the modern world has simply never touched. Number 4. The Mackenzie Mountains Northwest Territories/Yukon, just west of the Selwyns, separated by river valleys and the slow advance of boreal spruce, lies a range so enormous that its scale takes a moment to absorb. The Mackenzie Mountains stretch for over 800 kilometers along the NWT-Yukon border, a wall of peaks, glaciers, and high plateaus forming the eastern margin of the Cordilleran system. At their widest, they push nearly 300 kilometers from edge to edge. They are one of Canada's longest mountain chains, and almost nobody outside of wilderness adventurers and northern pilots knows they exist. Part of this is access. No paved road crosses the Mackenzie Mountains. The Canole Road, a wartime military route gouged through this wilderness during the Second World War as part of a desperate pipeline project to carry Yukon oil southward, still exists in degraded form, navigable in summer only by the most prepared of travelers. It is a road that the military abandoned mid-project as soon as the wartime emergency passed. The mountains refused the intrusion and reclaimed most of the evidence, but buried within the Mackenzies is something that puts them in an entirely different category. Virginia Falls, inside Nahanni National Park Reserve, drops 96 meters in a single unbroken plunge, nearly twice the height of Niagara Falls, into a canyon surrounded by mountains that seem to belong to another planet entirely. The South Nahanni River runs below through walls of limestone cut hundreds of meters deep, past hot springs that never freeze, regardless of the minus 40 degrees temperatures above. The geology here confounds expectations. The canyons cut across the grain of the mountains, which geologists describe as antecedent drainage. The river was flowing before the mountains fully rose and simply kept cutting downward as the rock lifted around it. Nahanni was one of the first UNESCO World Heritage Sites in Canada, designated in 1978. It has held that status for nearly 50 years, and still, the mountains surrounding it draw barely a few hundred serious visitors a year. However, the real mystery lies elsewhere, specifically in what those early prospectors who ventured into the Nahanni during the Klondike era called the Headless Valley. Two brothers who went in searching for gold were found dead, without their heads. 3 more prospectors vanished without trace. Whether the stories are history, exaggeration, or the kind of mythology that wilderness creates when it wants to protect itself, the Mackenzies earned a reputation in the north as mountains that swallow those who underestimate them. Number 3. The Ogilvy Mountains, Central Yukon, 150 kilometers northeast of Dawson City, where the last echoes of the Klondike Gold Rush still rattle through the buildings on Front Street. A range of ancient mountains rises quietly above the permafrost. The Ogilvies are compact by Canadian standards. Their highest peaks don't challenge the altitude records of the St. Elias or even the Mackenzies. But compactness is a deceptive quality here, because what the Ogilvy Mountains lack in raw elevation, they more than recover in geological age and sheer visual strangeness. These peaks are built from Precambrian and Paleozoic rock worn into shapes that look, at the right hour of light, more like a fever dream than a real landscape. The Dempster Highway, Canada's only all-season road above the Arctic Circle, running north from Dawson City all the way to Inuvik in the NWT, cuts directly through the heart of the Ogilvies. Travelers who make the long drive north pass through them without always registering what surrounds them. Bare tundra rolls across the high ground in shades of ochre and burnt sienna. Caribou cross the highway without breaking stride. And above it all, peaks rise that the permafrost has stripped of almost all vegetation, pure rock face, dark and ancient, holding the sky. But within the Ogilvies lies something that stops people who know where to look. Tombstone Territorial Park, one of the crown jewels of the Yukon's protected landscape, contains a collection of dark granite towers rising above wetland tundra that has been compared, without exaggeration, to the mountain landscapes of Patagonia. Tombstone Mountain itself, a jagged pyramid of Cretaceous granite, rises nearly 2,200 meters above tundra ponds that freeze solid for 8 months of the year. Yet what happened in this landscape tens of thousands of years ago makes the Ogilvies something more than scenic. This entire region was part of Beringia, the vast landmass that connected Asia and North America during the last ice age, when global sea levels had dropped enough to expose the floor of the Bering Strait. Remarkably, much of the Ogilvy area was never glaciated, even at the peak of the last ice age. It remained a refugium, an ice-free island in a world of ice, sheltering plants, mammals, and potentially the ancestors of North America's first human inhabitants. The land visible from the Dempster Highway today may be among the oldest continuously inhabited terrain on the continent. Wolverines, Arctic foxes, grizzly bears whose bloodlines stretch back through an unbroken lineage to animals that survived the Ice Age in these same valleys. And overhead, when the season is right, the aurora, green and violet and white, sweeping across peaks that predate the dinosaurs. Number 2. The Purcell Mountains, southeastern British Columbia, Montana, Idaho. We return one final time to British Columbia, but to a range that belongs, in geological terms, to a completely different era of Earth's history than anything we have discussed. The Purcell Mountains rise between the Rocky Mountain Trench to the east and the Columbia River Valley to the west, running from southeastern BC southward into Montana and Idaho. Their highest peaks top out around 3,400 meters, respectable but not record-setting. By the standards of altitude, they are not the most dramatic mountains on this list. But the rock that forms them is another matter entirely. The Purcells are built largely from the Belt-Purcell supergroup, layers of sedimentary rock deposited on the floor of a shallow inland sea between 1, 4, and 1.5 billion years ago. When those sediments were accumulating on that ancient seafloor, complex multicellular life had not yet evolved. The oceans were inhabited by bacteria and single-celled organisms. The atmosphere contained far less oxygen than we breathe today. The rocks of the Purcells contain fossilized microbial mats, some of the oldest biological evidence preserved in stone anywhere on Earth. The Canadian Rockies just to the east, those famous and celebrated mountains, are young by comparison. Their uplifting began roughly 60 to 80 million years ago. The Purcells were already ancient when the first Rockies began to stir. But that isn't even the most surprising part. Hidden within the Purcells, accessible only by helicopter or a long approach hike, is a landscape known among serious mountaineers as one of the most visually dramatic places in North America, the Boogaboos. Granite spires, Snowpatch Spire, Boogaboo Spire, the Hauser Towers erupt from a hanging glacier in forms so sharp and vertical they look structurally impossible. These walls draw technical climbers from around the world. The routes up them are numbered among the great alpine challenges on the continent. Conrad Kane, one of Canada's greatest early mountaineers, made the first ascents of several of these spires in the early 20th century. He described the rock as the finest granite climbing he had encountered anywhere in the world. Those routes still carry his name. The mountains still carry his silence. The Purcells are ancient, extraordinary, and they are holding evidence in their stone of a world that existed before almost everything alive today had yet imagined itself into being. Number 1. The Torngat Mountains, northern Labrador, northern Quebec. We have crossed an entire continent to reach this, and nothing else on this list quite prepares you for it. Drive as far north as the road network will take you in Labrador, then board a small plane. Keep flying north, past the last permanent community, past the last road, past the last visible sign of the modern world, into a coastline that runs along the Labrador Sea in a series of fjords so deep, so cold, so utterly removed from anything familiar that the landscape seems to belong to a different planet. The Torngat Mountains rise at the very northern tip of the Labrador Peninsula, stretching along the Atlantic coast and the border with northern Quebec in a chain of glacier-carved ridgelines, bare rock faces, and knife-edged summits that drop directly into the sea. Their highest point, Mount Cobvic, known in Quebec as Mont d'Iberville, stands at 1,652 meters. By raw altitude, modest. By everything else, incomparable. The Torngats are among the oldest mountains in the Western Hemisphere. Their cores are made of gneiss and granite that formed between 1.2 and 1.9 billion years ago. Geology so ancient that it predates the evolution of animals on Earth by nearly a billion years. What you see today is the worn-down skeleton of a mountain system that once stood as high as the Alps. Time and successive ice ages have stripped it to its bones. The result is something raw, exposed, and deeply affecting in a way that younger, taller mountains rarely manage. Torngat comes from Torngate, a word in Inuktitut, the language of the Inuit, meaning the dwelling place of spirits. For the Labrador Inuit and the Innu peoples who have known these mountains for thousands of years, this was never simply geography. These peaks were alive. They were inhabited, not metaphorically but literally, by Torngarsuk, the most powerful of spiritual beings. Shamans made the journey to this coastline, specifically to seek contact with what lived here. The mountains were a threshold between the human world and something that the human world could not fully contain, and the archaeology confirms that this was never empty land. Torngat Mountains National Park was officially established in 2005. It is one of the least visited national parks in Canada. In a typical year, fewer than 1,000 people make the journey. There are no roads, no permanent visitor facilities, no bridges. Base camp near Saglik Fjord is a seasonal collection of tents and research stations. Polar bear monitors, armed, trained, and very serious about their work, accompany every visitor group at all times. When most people think of Canadian mountains, they think of the Rockies, of Banff, of Jasper, of those iconic silhouettes framed against an October sky, reflected in water too blue to believe. And those mountains are extraordinary, genuinely, undeniably, in every way. But Canada is not one mountain story, it is dozens. It is a billion-year-old seafloor rising in the Purcells. It is the silence of the Selwyns, where no trail has been cut and no trail is planned. It is the snowmelt rivers of the Monachese, still running clear through cedar forests that have never seen a chainsaw. It is the gold rush ghost country of the Caribous, where a mountain range absorbed an entire civilization and gave nothing back. It is the headless valley of the Mackenzies, where a UNESCO World Heritage river runs through canyons that geologists are still trying to explain. It is the Ice Age refugium of the Ogilvies, where grizzlies still live in the same valleys their ancestors survived in when the world was frozen solid. And at the edge of all of it, at the furthest point, on the oldest rock, under the coldest sky, the Torngats stand where they have always stood, unnamed by most of the world, known deeply only by the people whose language gave them a name that translates accurately as the place where spirits live. The world knows Banff. The world does not know Noshvac Fjord, and that perhaps is the most remarkable fact of all. that a country can contain landscapes of this geological magnitude, wonders of this ecological scale, places of this ancient human significance, and keep them almost effortlessly secret. Canada's most famous mountains are on the postcard. Canada's greatest mountains are still out there in the silence, beyond the last road, beyond the last sign, beyond everything familiar, and they are not waiting for you to arrive. They were here long before you, and they will be here long after. That is the whole point. That is the whole story.